Welcome back. Next up is the fallacy known as hasty generalization. Maybe you can guess from the name that it refers to a generalization that is made hastily, or too quickly, without all the facts. Another name for this fallacy is proof by selected instances. The speaker tries to prove an argument with only one or a few examples. If you think about it, you can disprove an argument with only one or a few examples. That's a counterargument, or a counterexample, like we discussed previously. But the same technique can't be used to prove something, even though people try it all the time. Just because you can find one or a few examples of something won't prove that all of that kind of thing are like that. But all it takes is one counterexample to prove that not all of them are. Here's an example. All cats have white tails. I know this because my cat has a white tail. Now, of course, if you know anything about cats, you know that this person is in error. Just because their cat has a white tail doesn't mean that all cats have white tails. It only takes one counterexample to disprove a generalization like this. So, of course, you can't expect that you can make a generalization like this with only one example. In premise-conclusion form, the argument would say this. Premise: my cat has a white tail. Conclusion: all cats have white tails. Our counterexample shows us that this is false. You can see that the general form of a hasty generalization is premise: one P is Q, or a few P are Q. Conclusion: therefore, all P are Q. Now, the only way that we can really know and conclude that all P are Q is to check out every P, whatever it is, every P in the whole wide world, and make sure that it is Q. The minute you find a P that is not Q, the statement's false. You've found a counterexample to the statement. Here's another example that you might hear from a grade school girl. I tried to talk to that boy Tommy yesterday and he stuck his tongue out at me. Boys are so mean. Now, in premise-conclusion form, the argument could look like this. Premise: Tommy stuck his tongue out at me. Conclusion: all boys are mean. Now, how is this a hasty generalization? Well, we might be able to conclude that Tommy is mean, but even that's pushing it. Maybe he just likes to stick his tongue out. But from this one example, we cannot conclude that all boys are mean. The only way that we can know for sure that all boys are mean is to investigate every single boy in the world and determine whether they are mean or not. The minute you find a nice one, or one that's being nice at the moment, the generalization no longer applies. Now, most boys I have known are capable of being either, or both. These generalizations would not be fallacious if they only generalized to what they could legitimately generalize to. For example, my cat has a white tail, therefore I can guess that there might be other cats with white tails. Well, that's okay. This generalization is legitimate. For one thing, it's not generalizing to all cats. It's basically saying that some cats might have white tails, and that's a lot easier to prove than all cats. If you think about the cats in your own experience, you'd probably agree that this is true. Some cats have white tails, but not all cats have white tails. Also, pay attention to the language used. The speaker uses words like guess and might be rather than conclude and are. Now, these are more tentative words that allow for the possibility that the generalization could be wrong. Now, using tentative language is not always appropriate to do, especially if you want to inspire confidence in somebody. But the tentative words are less misleading here than absolute words would be. In the end, if you only have one example of a cat with a white tail, you can't know for sure that there are others. You can guess, but you don't know until you find other cats with white tails. The speaker in this case is admitting that. You have to be careful when you see generalizations in real life because the speaker will not always admit that they are just making guesses. What about our example with Tommy? What could we legitimately conclude after our experience with him? Here's what I came up with. I tried to talk to that new boy Tommy yesterday, and he stuck his tongue out at me. That wasn't very polite of him. Now, with just the one experience with Tommy, that's pretty much all you can conclude. He did something that wasn't polite. What you can conclude is that he does or has done one or more rude things. But that's really all. So far, so good. The next fallacy we will look at is called slippery slope. For this, you can think of a slippery slide or a water slide. Once you get started on it, there's no stopping until you reach the end. For instance, once you start going down a water slide, you don't stop partway through and then try to go back up. You keep going down, down, down. Some of the best examples of the slippery slope fallacy that I can think of are the DirecTV commercials from a few years ago. The story starts with the main character staying with his cable company, and then all sorts of horrible things happen. In the one that I'm thinking of, the character starts by getting angry that he is put on hold by his cable company. Then he goes to play racquetball, and he's injured in the game. So he goes to the doctor and receives an eye patch. Eventually, he ends up in a roadside ditch, all because he didn't switch to DirecTV. Now, why is this kind of thinking fallacious? Well, it assumes a chain of events that there really isn't any evidence for. For instance, maybe the character doesn't get angry that he's put on hold by his cable company. And if so, that's the end of the story. And if he goes to play racquetball, maybe he doesn't get injured. And so forth. If you'd like to see this commercial, you can search online for DirecTV commercial, "Don't wake up in a roadside ditch." The form of the slippery slope argument looks something like this. Premise: if A is true, then B is true. Premise: if B is true, then C is true. Premise: if C is true, then D is true. And so on. Premise: we don't want D to be true. Conclusion: therefore, we must avoid A. From the form, you can tell that this is a fallacy because there's nothing stopping B from being true without A being true, or C or D for that matter. Also, as we can see from the commercial, these premises aren't necessarily true in and of themselves. We don't have any evidence that B will be true if A is true. Now, we all know that DirecTV is just trying to be funny. It's funny because the whole thing is so unlikely. They don't really think that you're going to end up in a ditch if you stay with cable. And they don't really think that anybody else is actually going to believe that. But this kind of reasoning does get used sometimes in real life. Let's look at a couple more examples. Here's a real-life example from the Savannah Morning News, September 22nd, 2011. Presumably, an artist or property owner had applied for permission from the city to put up an art mural at a particular location. Here's what one person said about it. "I hope the art mural will not be allowed. You open the gate for one, you open it for all, and you'll have it all over the city. A person wanting to paint on buildings is nothing more than upscale graffiti. More than likely, it will go too far. Well, where's the fallacy in this argument? As I understand it, the person who wrote it isn't just worried that if the city allows one mural, more people will want to paint murals in other places. That is something that could happen, though we don't know for sure. But the writer here is asserting that it won't just be a few artistic murals. If the city allows one mural, then illegal graffiti will probably increase throughout the city. The writer is using that as a reason why the mural should not be allowed in the first place, because it will lead to an increase in graffiti. Sure, that could happen, but the writer hasn't provided any evidence that it is likely to happen. The writer is just speculating on what could happen. The idea that one art mural that's put up legally is the first in a chain of events that leads to increased graffiti is an example of the slippery slope fallacy. Why would people use this fallacy? Sometimes they believe what they're saying. Sometimes the chain of events is possible, even if it's unproven or unlikely. Other times, they are just trying to prove their argument however they can. If they can convince you that terrible things can result from one action, you're less likely to take the action, right? Here's another example. Parent to first grader. If you color outside the lines, you are undisciplined. If you are undisciplined in first grade, you won't be ready for high school when the time comes. If you aren't ready for high school when the time comes, you won't get into medical school later on. And if you don't get into medical school, you won't become a famous medical correspondent. I want the best for my child, so color inside the lines. Maybe you've heard this kind of argument before someplace. Sure, it's important for kids to learn self-discipline and so forth, but coloring outside the lines in first grade is not going to doom the poor kid to a miserable future. Furthermore, coloring inside the lines is not going to guarantee that the kid will become a famous medical correspondent someday. We can label this one a fallacy. One more thing. Sometimes parents and teachers use slippery slope type arguments when they are trying to teach their audience to stay away from various forms of temptation. For instance, they might say, don't ever try alcohol because that first drink might lead to another, and then you might wind up an alcoholic. Now, while this might technically be a fallacy in many cases, there are people in this world who drink responsibly. The danger of going too far is real, especially among young people who don't have a lot of experience with setting personal boundaries and who have a lot of peer pressure not to. So, a slippery slope argument can be a useful teaching tool. It is important to consider possible consequences of actions that you're considering. In this case, we don't know that one drink will lead to another, but we do know that it certainly can, and often does. And the consequences are heavy enough that it's worth making people think about. If the proposed chain of events is actually expected to happen, then the argument is not a fallacy. For example, when I was teaching school, I learned very quickly that if one student asked to go to the bathroom and I let them, suddenly half the kids in the class would ask to go to the bathroom. No joke. I learned to expect this chain of events. One person asks, and then another, and then another. If I told the first person who asked, if I let you go, half the class will want to go too, yeah, that really was true. That was not a fallacy. But it was my experience that was evidence that it would happen, and the students knew that it would happen too, based on their experience. Well, it's time for another quiz. You know what to do.